Imagine a world where the entire Earth is submerged underwater. Cities, forests, and mountains all vanished beneath the waves. All of humanity wiped out in an instant, except for a lucky few survivors on a lonely boat. You've heard this story before, right? In fact, there are over 500 flood myths out there, making it one of the most common tales humans have ever told. It's been recounted in different ways by people all over the world. There's Noah's Ark, of course, but also deluge narratives from the Aztecs, the Sumerians, the Chinese, the Maori, and countless other cultures. Each version has its unique details, but they all share a remarkably similar core story. A great flood that nearly wiped out humanity. But why? Why did people from different continents living centuries apart all come up with such similar stories? Is it just a coincidence, or is there more to it? What could have been the catalyst for these stories? Could there be a scientific explanation behind these seemingly mythical events? In this video, we're going to get to the bottom of this mystery. We'll start by examining the oldest flood stories we know of, from places like Mesopotamia and the Americas. We'll try to understand what these stories meant to the people who told them, and what they can teach us about how humans have always tried to make sense of the unbelievable, chaotic world around us. But we'll also look at the science behind these stories. Could some of them be based on actual events? Like, could the story of Noah's Ark have been inspired by a real mega flood in the Black Sea? And what about the Aztec flood myth? Could that be connected to an actual tsunami? We'll explore these possibilities, bridging the gap between myth and science. Watch until the end, and you'll see these famous stories in a completely new way. We'll dig deep into the fascinating world of flood myths, and you'll never think about a rainstorm the same way again. So, explore the legends of a flooded world together. Historical context. Let's look at the historical context of flood myths. Most people know about Noah's Ark from the Bible. But did you know that flood stories were told by cultures all over the world, long before the Bible was written? From Mesopotamia to the Americas, people have been telling stories about catastrophic floods for thousands of years. The oldest flood myth we know of comes from the Sumerians, who lived in what's now southern Iraq, around 4500 BCE. The Sumerians were a big deal. They invented writing and agriculture and built the first cities, but living near the Tigris and Euphrates rivers had its risks. In ancient times, the Tigris and Euphrates were very different from what they are today. They flowed through a vast flat plain and had no natural barriers to contain them. During the rainy season, or when the snow melted in the mountains, the rivers would overflow their banks and submerge the surrounding land. These floods could be catastrophic, wiping out whole cities and destroying crops. The Sumerians believed that the gods were responsible for these floods and that they had to be kept happy to avoid disaster. One of the most important Sumerian flood stories is about a king named Ziusudra. According to clay tablets from around 2000 BCE, the gods decided to destroy humanity with a huge flood. But one god, Enki, warned Ziusudra and told him to build a big boat to save himself, his family, and animals of every kind. Ziusudra followed Enki's instructions and survived the flood. After 7 days and 7 nights on the boat, he sent out birds to find dry land. When the birds didn't come back, he knew the flood was over. Ziusudra then left the boat, built an altar, and made sacrifices to the gods. Pleased by his faith, obedience, and role in preserving the seed of mankind through the flood, the gods, especially Enki, granted Ziusudra the reward of eternal life for his righteousness. If this story sounds familiar, it's because it has a lot in common with later flood myths from around the world. The ancient Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, dating back to around 2500 BCE, contains another early flood story. It tells of Utnapishtim, who was warned by the god Ea to build a boat to survive a great deluge sent by the gods. Moving to the Indian subcontinent, the Hindu Puranas, ancient Sanskrit texts dating back to the 3rd century BCE, also contain a flood myth. In this story, Manu is warned by a fish avatar of the god Vishnu about an impending flood and instructed to build a boat to survive. Even in ancient Greece, great floods are a common mythological theme. The poet Ovid, in his Metamorphoses written around 8 CE, recounts the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. In this tale, Zeus sends a flood to punish human wickedness, with Deucalion and Pyrrha as the sole survivors. They repopulate the world by throwing stones that turn into people. Many experts think these flood myths, including the biblical story of Noah's Ark, were inspired by the much older Sumerian tale of Ziusudra, which would have been well known in the ancient Near East. The similarities suggest they all drew from a shared tradition passed down through the centuries. For the Sumerians, the flood wasn't just a random disaster. It was divine punishment for human misbehavior. But Ziusudra's story also showed that by living a righteous life and staying in the gods' favor, even an apocalyptic flood could be survived. The Ziusudra story was part of a larger collection of Sumerian tales about the creation and early history of the world. These stories, passed down orally for generations before being recorded in writing, were a key part of Sumerian culture and religion. As the Sumerians were conquered by later Mesopotamian empires, like the Babylonians, their stories spread throughout the region and beyond, planting the seeds for a tradition of flood myths that would span the globe. These tales aren't just interesting ancient stories. They offer a window into how some of the world's first civilizations understood their world. For the Sumerians, life was shaped by the unpredictable power of nature and the whims of the gods. Stories like the Great Flood, which were often used to teach moral lessons and reinforce societal norms, helped them make sense of the disasters that could strike at any time, and gave them hope that with divine favor, even the worst catastrophes could be endured. As we explore more flood stories from around the world, keep the Sumerians and Ziusudra in mind. Their story is the foundation upon which so many later flood myths would build. By understanding where this tradition began, we can better appreciate the rich variety of deluge stories that followed in the Sumerians' wake. Flood myths from around the world. The flood stories we've looked at so far, from Mesopotamia, the Bible, and ancient Greece, are just the tip of the iceberg. Cultures all over the world have their own unique flood myths. While the details may differ, these stories all tap into the same deep human fears and hopes. Take the story of Tidalit the frog from Aboriginal Australian mythology. Tidalit was a giant frog with a never-ending thirst. He drank up all the water in the world, leaving everything dry and lifeless. The other animals knew they had to make Tidalit laugh to get the water back. They tried everything, but nothing worked, until an eel tied himself in knots, and Tidalit laughed so hard that all the water came gushing out, flooding the world and bringing life back. Meanwhile, way up in Scandinavia, the ancient Norse had their own flood tale. They believed that the world was made from the body of a giant named Ymir. When the god Odin and his brothers killed Ymir, his blood gushed out and drowned almost all the other giants. Only 2 survived by hopping onto a box and floating away. Those 2 giants went on to create a whole new race of giants. Across the Atlantic, many Native American cultures have flood stories too. The Choctaw people of the American Southeast say that long ago, the Great Spirit sent a flood to wipe out the evil in the world. Only a few good people survived by clinging to a raft. Afterwards, the Great Spirit sent a rainbow as a sign of forgiveness. The Inuit of the Arctic have a flood myth with a tragic twist. They say that once, a girl married a seagull and went to live with him in the sky. But when she broke a taboo and tried to come back to Earth, her father's tears flooded the world, and the girl drowned. Her fingers turned into seals, and the rest of her body became different sea creatures. In Maori mythology from New Zealand, the demigod Maui is said to have fished up the North Island from the ocean depths, causing a great flood that drowned many people. This story reflects the Maori understanding of their islands as being born from the sea. The Tlingit people of the Pacific Northwest have their own flood story, which tells of a man named Nax In, who was warned by a friendly raven to build a raft to survive a coming deluge. Nax In heeded the warning and survived the flood along with his family. In the Islamic tradition, the story of Noah's Ark appears in the Quran, with Noah being referred to as Nuh. According to the Quran, the flood was sent by God as a punishment for those who rejected Nuh's message and refused to follow the path of righteousness. As in the biblical account, Nuh built an ark and saved the faithful. These stories might sound like pure fantasy, but they tell us a lot about how different cultures have tried to understand the world. The Aboriginal tale of Tiddalik could be a way of making sense of Australia's cycles of drought and flood. The Norse myth of Ymir's blood fits into a bigger picture of creation and destruction, showing the Vikings' view of a harsh and unpredictable universe. The Choctaw flood story has a lot in common with the biblical story of Noah, with its ideas of divine punishment and forgiveness. And the haunting Inuit tale of the drowned girl reflects the very real dangers of life in the Arctic, where the icy waters can claim lives in an instant. The Maori story of Maui fishing up the North Island shows how flood myths could be used to explain the origins of landforms and the shaping of the world. The Tlingit story of Nax In and the Raven demonstrates the importance of heeding warnings and being prepared for disaster. But is it possible that real events like massive monsoons, tsunamis, or glacial bursts inspired some of these flood myths? But they stuck around for so long because they speak to something deeper. The human need to find meaning when the world seems scary and out of control. Scientific explanations. For most of modern history, flood myths were dismissed as just that, myths, purely imaginative tales with no connection to reality. But in recent decades, scientists have started uncovering intriguing evidence that some of these stories may have been inspired by real catastrophic flood events after all. The main reason for this shift in perspective has been the work of geologists and archaeologists who have found physical proof of ancient floods that match the descriptions in some legends. One of the most prominent examples is the Black Sea flood hypothesis, which suggests that the Black Sea was once a freshwater lake that was inundated by the Mediterranean Sea around 5600 BCE. According to this theory, proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the late 1990s, the rising Mediterranean burst through the Bosporus Strait, flooding the Black Sea with catastrophic speed. If true, it would have been a traumatic event for the Neolithic farming communities living along the Black Sea coast. As the water level rose over 500 feet, it would have inundated thousands of square miles of land, destroying villages and forcing people to flee for their lives. Ryan and Pittman proposed that the survivors' stories of this terrifying flood spread throughout the Middle East, potentially inspiring flood legends like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and later the biblical story of Noah. Another possible inspiration for ancient flood myths is the Missoula floods, a series of cataclysmic glacial lake outburst floods that swept through the Pacific Northwest of North America at the end of the last ice age. Geological evidence suggests that one particularly massive flood occurred in the Altai Mountains of Siberia around 8000 BCE, potentially inspiring flood myths in Central Asia and the Middle East. In the Mediterranean, the eruption of the Thera volcano in the Aegean Sea around 1600 BCE, which triggered devastating tsunamis, has been proposed as a possible inspiration for the Greek flood myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The destruction of the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete by these tsunamis could have left a deep cultural memory that was later mythologized. Other ancient floods have also been suggested as possible sources for flood myths. In the Tigris-Euphrates Valley of Mesopotamia, archaeologists have found evidence of many historical floods caused by the two great rivers overflowing their banks. A particularly large flood around 2900 BCE left a layer of silt nearly 10 feet thick at the ancient Sumerian city of Shuruppak. Might this disaster have been mythologized in the Sumerian story of Ziusudra? Similar flood deposits have been found in the Yellow River Valley of China, along the Indus River in Pakistan, and in many other regions where ancient civilizations flourished near major waterways. Wherever ancient peoples lived near water, it seems, catastrophic floods occurred from time to time, leaving an indelible mark on cultural memory. However, it's important to note that while these real floods were certainly devastating for the communities affected, none come close to the scale of the global cataclysms described in most flood myths. The geological evidence simply doesn't support the idea of a worldwide deluge that covered all mountains and wiped out all life except for a lucky few in a boat. The largest known freshwater flood in history, the Missoula floods, involved a volume of water 10 times the combined flow of all the world's rivers. But even this unimaginable torrent only inundated parts of the Pacific Northwest. It was a regional catastrophe, not a global one. So if there was no literal worldwide flood, why do so many cultures have such similar stories of a universal deluge? One reason may be that the experience of catastrophic flooding, even on a local scale, left such a powerful psychological impact that it became mythologized over time. For ancient peoples, floods represented the awesome and terrifying destructive power of nature. Raging floodwaters could sweep away in moments all that humans had painstakingly built up over generations. In an instant, the very foundations of society, homes, farms, temples, could vanish beneath the churning tide, reduced to nothing more than muddy sediment. Faced with such unimaginable destruction, it's not surprising that floods took on mythic proportions in the cultural imagination. A flood that drowned one's entire world, the only world one knew, could easily become a flood that drowned the whole world. Over centuries of retelling, an especially devastating local flood could be transformed into a universal one. Cultural significance. One common theme in flood myths is the idea that the gods send floods to punish humans for bad behavior. In the Sumerian story, the gods flood the world because humans are too noisy. In Aztec myths, the gods get angry when people don't respect them enough. And in Greek stories, Zeus floods the earth because he's fed up with human wickedness. In these stories, the flood is like a giant reset button, wiping out corruption and giving the world a fresh start. This idea of divine punishment probably made a lot of sense to ancient people. Back then, life could be really tough. Floods, famines, diseases, you name it. It could feel like disaster was always just around the corner. By saying that the gods caused these disasters to punish humans, flood myths helped people find a reason behind all the chaos. It was comforting to think that even the worst catastrophes were part of the gods' plan. But flood myths aren't all doom and gloom. They also show that being good pays off. In most of these stories, a few righteous humans are spared from destruction because of their virtue and loyalty to the gods. Noah, Utnapishtim, Deucalion and Pyrrha. They all survive because they're the cream of the crop, morally speaking. This reflects ancient beliefs about the importance of piety and the special bond between gods and humans. It suggests that even in the worst times, goodness will be rewarded. Another big theme in flood myths is the idea of destruction and rebirth. The flood wipes out the old, corrupt world, but it also makes way for a new, fresh start. It's like how real floods can be devastating, but they also leave behind rich soil for new growth. In flood myths, the world is cleansed of evil, allowing a pure new society to rise from the ashes. This idea of death and regeneration was especially meaningful for ancient agricultural societies. Their lives revolved around the cycles of planting, harvesting, and the yearly flooding of rivers. Flood myths reminded them that even after the worst disasters, life could begin again. In this way, flood myths often symbolize the cyclical nature of life, death and rebirth, reflecting the seasonal cycles of agriculture and the natural world. The ark or boat that appears in many flood myths can also be seen as a symbol of rebirth and renewal. It acts as a kind of symbolic womb, carrying the seeds of life through the cataclysm of the flood. From this vessel, a new world is born, just as new life emerges from the womb. Another common symbol in flood myths is the rainbow, which often appears after the waters recede. In the biblical story, the rainbow is a sign of God's covenant with Noah, promising never to destroy the world by flood again. More generally, the rainbow symbolizes hope, renewal, and the restoration of the bond between the divine and humanity after the rupture of the flood. On a deeper level, flood myths are closely connected to each culture's fundamental beliefs about the world. The biblical flood is central to Christian ideas about sin, punishment, and salvation. The Aztec flood myth is tied to their beliefs about the cycles of creation, and the Greek flood story reflects their view of gods who are powerful but also flawed, just like humans. Flood myths and modern disasters. Flood myths might seem like ancient history, but they have a lot in common with the very real disasters that still happen today. From tsunamis to hurricanes to glacial dam bursts, the destructive power of water is just as much a part of our world as it was for our ancestors. Take the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004. On December 26th of that year, a massive earthquake off the coast of Sumatra triggered a series of tsunamis that slammed into the coasts of Southeast Asia. Walls of water up to 100 feet high crashed ashore, obliterating entire villages and taking over 200,000 lives. For the survivors, it must have felt like something out of a flood myth. The ocean, which had always been a source of life, suddenly turned into an unstoppable force of destruction. Homes, schools, and temples were washed away in an instant. Families were ripped apart, and whole communities were left in ruins. In the wake of the disaster, people struggled to make sense of it all. Some saw it as divine punishment, just like in the old stories. Others saw it as a harsh warning of nature's incredible power. The stories that came out of the tsunami, stories of miraculous survival and heartbreaking loss, of heroism and resilience, echoed the themes of flood myths from long ago. More recently, the 2021 European flood showed that even the most modern societies are still vulnerable to the fury of water. In July of that year, record-breaking rainfall led to devastating floods across Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Rivers overflowed, washing away towns and cities. Dams and levees collapsed, turning streets into raging rivers. Over 200 people died, and the damage was estimated at over 10 billion euros. As shocking as the European floods were, they weren't unique. Just 16 years earlier, Hurricane Katrina had caused similar devastation in New Orleans. The storm surge overwhelmed the city's flood defenses, leaving 80% of the city underwater. Over 1,800 people lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands were left homeless. The haunting images of people trapped on rooftops, of entire neighborhoods turned to rubble, are impossible to forget. In each of these modern disasters, we can hear the echoes of ancient flood myths, the sudden, terrifying transformation of water from a life-giving force to a deadly one, the struggle to comprehend the scale of the destruction, to find meaning in what seems meaningless, the desperate search for safety, and the overwhelming grief for all that was lost. But there's a key difference between flood myths and these modern catastrophes. In the old stories, floods were seen as deliberate acts of divine punishment. The gods were angry at human sin and decided to start over. Today, we know that disasters like tsunamis, hurricanes, and flash floods aren't supernatural punishments. They're the result of natural forces that are mostly beyond our control. It's plate tectonics, weather patterns, and the physics of water that determine when and where floods happen, not the whims of angry gods. In a way, this scientific understanding makes catastrophic floods even more unsettling. Despite all our knowledge and technology, we're still at the mercy of forces far more powerful than ourselves. All our engineering can't completely protect us from the raw chaos of nature. And with climate change, that chaos is only getting worse. As the world gets warmer, we're seeing more frequent and severe flooding in many regions. Warmer oceans fuel stronger hurricanes, while warmer air holds more moisture, leading to heavier rainfall. Rising sea levels, driven by melting ice and expanding warm water, put coastal communities at ever greater risk. In this context, flood myths take on new meaning. They remind us that the battle against the destructive power of water is as old as civilization itself. They speak to the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of unthinkable adversity. But they're also a warning, a reminder to stay humble in an age when we often think we can control nature. The ancient storytellers understood that humans are not separate from the natural world, but deeply interconnected with it. They knew that our survival depends on respecting the awesome power of the earth and the elements. These ancient tales, passed down through countless generations, speak to some of the most fundamental aspects of the human experience: the fear of the unknown, the awe of nature's power, the hunger for meaning and purpose, the eternal hope for rebirth and renewal. Though the details differ from culture to culture, flood myths reveal the common threads that bind us together across time and space. At their core, these stories are about finding order in chaos, significance in tragedy, hope in despair. They reflect our shared instinct to search for deeper meaning when confronted with disaster, to believe that even the most horrific events happen for a reason. Flood myths affirmed people's faith that they were part of a larger story, that their suffering was not random or meaningless, but part of a divine plan. At the same time, flood myths also serve as a warning, a reminder of our vulnerability in a world where the forces of nature still reign supreme. We may have tamed many of the threats our ancestors faced, but we are still at the mercy of powers beyond our control. From hurricanes to tsunamis to climate change, these ancient stories caution us against blinding pride and against believing we are invincible masters of our domain. But flood myths also offer comfort and hope. They promise that no matter how much is lost or destroyed, life will find a way to begin again. Just as the mythological floods wiped the slate clean for a new creation, every ending we experience is also a chance for a new beginning. Every tragedy we suffer is also an opportunity for growth and transformation. The themes found in these tales still resonate today. We may no longer believe that angry gods send floods to punish human wickedness, but we still grapple with the same existential questions our ancestors did. The stories we tell shape how we see the world and our place in it. They help us make sense of the mysteries and hardships of existence. Flood myths are an essential part of that storytelling tradition, giving voice to our deepest fears and our highest hopes. These ancient tales of drowned worlds and reborn civilizations are more than just historical curiosities. They are mirrors that reflect the eternal struggles and triumphs of the human experience. They remind us that even in a world that can feel chaotic and cruel, we are all part of a larger story. A story of destruction and creation, of despair and hope, of death and rebirth, the story of us.